There are places in history that do not scream. They do not announce themselves with blood or fire or sudden tragedy. They exist quietly, for years, sometimes decades, and by the time anyone realizes what they were hiding, it is already far too late. This is the story of one of those places. In the year 1834, in a stretch of rural Virginia where dirt roads outnumbered names, there stood a farmhouse. Not a mansion, not a ruin, just a farmhouse. Wooden walls weathered by rain, a sloping roof, fields that rolled gently into the tree line. The kind of place you would pass without looking twice. No legends followed it, no ghost stories, no warnings whispered at night. And that was the first thing that made it dangerous. The farm belonged to a family everyone knew. Not famous, not powerful, just familiar. They attended church, they greeted neighbors by name, they worked their land season after season, as families had done for generations. Children played nearby, livestock moved through the fields, smoke rose gently from the chimney in the mornings. Nothing about the house demanded attention. And in a small community, that was enough to earn trust. In places like this, trust wasn't earned loudly. It was inherited, passed from neighbor to neighbor through routine. You trusted people because you had always trusted them, because your parents had, because the church did, because questioning someone without proof was considered worse than being wrong. And so the farm remained unchallenged. But history has a way of leaving fingerprints, small ones, the kind people notice and then immediately explain away. A sound at the wrong hour, a locked door that never opened, visitors who didn't stay long and were never spoken about again. Nothing solid, nothing provable, just enough to make the curious uncomfortable and the cautious silent. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from, and ask yourself this: if everyone around you trusted a family completely, would you? Leave a comment with your location and your instinct, because instinct matters in this story. The farm did not speak. It did not confess. It did not warn. It simply existed, day after day, year after year, while seasons changed, while children grew, while the world slowly moved forward. The farmhouse remained exactly the same, and beneath it, nothing was ever discussed. If stories like this, stories where history hides in plain sight, interest you, you may want to stay with us, not because this story is frightening, but because it is real.
In small communities, names matter. Not the kind written in books or newspapers, but the kind spoken casually at church doors, across fences, over shared meals. The Sullivan name was one of those. It carried no weight of power, no hint of prestige, no reputation for excess or cruelty. It was simply familiar. Ezra Sullivan had been born into the region, or close enough that no one could remember otherwise. He worked the land with steady hands, rose early, returned home before dark. He was not a man of speeches, not charismatic, not charming, but reliability in rural Virginia was more valuable than charm. Constance Sullivan was known for her quiet presence. She spoke softly, kept her eyes lowered in company, and rarely contradicted anyone in public. To some she seemed reserved, to others modest, to most invisible in the way women were expected to be. Together they fit perfectly into the shape the community expected. They attended church regularly, never loudly, never late. They sat where they always sat, stood when others stood, kneeled when others kneeled. Faith in that era was not a private matter, it was social proof, and the Sullivans never failed to provide it. When collections were taken, their contribution appeared without comment. When charity was needed, their help was offered without spectacle. They did not boast, they did not explain, and that restraint made them trustworthy. People remember the loud sinners, they remember the proud hypocrites, they rarely remember the quiet ones. The Sullivan farm became known over time as a place of modest generosity, food shared during hard seasons, temporary shelter offered without question, work provided to those who asked. Nothing dramatic, nothing excessive, just enough to build a reputation that protected itself. Children were sometimes seen near the property, some passing through, some staying longer than others. In a farming region that raised no alarm, children worked, children wandered, children were sent to relatives, to neighbors, to anyone who could offer a meal and a bed. No records were kept carefully, no questions were asked insistently. It was assumed that someone else knew the details, and assumption is one of history's most dangerous habits. Ezra was described as stern but fair, Constance as devout and self-sacrificing. If disagreements occurred, they were quiet. If tensions existed, they never spilled into public view. Their home was orderly, their routines predictable. Predictability, again, bred comfort, and comfort dulls suspicion. When travelers passed through the area, the Sullivans were sometimes mentioned as a safe stop, a place that would not turn away the desperate. No one questioned how often that happened. No one counted, because the idea of counting would have required the idea of doubt, and doubt had no place in a community built on shared survival. What is most unsettling in hindsight is not what people missed, but what they saw and chose to understand in the safest possible way. A locked door was practical, a closed cellar was sensible, privacy was respected. In a world where everyone depended on everyone else, prying was considered rude, silence was considered polite, and the Sullivans were very polite. Years passed like this. Children grew, neighbors aged. The world beyond Virginia changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, and through it all, the Sullivan name remained steady, untouched, unquestioned. If you lived here, if you shared their pew, their road, their seasons, would you ever have suspected them? Be honest with yourself. Leave a comment with your answer. Because history shows us something uncomfortable. The most trusted names are often the last ones we examine, and sometimes they are the ones hiding the most.
Rural Virginia did not gossip the way cities did. There were no crowded streets, no newspapers hungry for scandal, no strangers eager to speculate. Information moved slowly, carried by routine rather than urgency. A comment made while repairing a fence, a pause during a shared meal, a glance exchanged at the edge of a gathering. Whispers did not travel far, they lingered, and when they linger long enough, they begin to shape the air of a place.
At first, nothing was spoken plainly. There was only the sense that something, not wrong, but slightly out of alignment, existed near the Sullivan farm. It was the kind of feeling people dismissed instinctively, an impression without proof, a thought without language. Someone mentioned sounds at night, but only once, and only in passing. Animals unsettled, perhaps. Wood settling. Old houses made noises. Another person remarked on how often the cellar door stayed closed, but cellars were private, and winter stores needed protection. Someone else noticed that certain children seemed to arrive quietly and leave without farewell. But children moved constantly in those years. They were sent where food existed. They were borrowed for labor. They were handed off without ceremony. Each observation, on its own, meant nothing, and so each one was allowed to dissolve before it could connect to another. That is how communities survive discomfort. They separate it into pieces too small to threaten belief. When small unease appears, it is softened. When questions form, they are redirected. Because asking the wrong question in a small place could isolate you, and isolation in a rural world was dangerous. No one wanted to be the person who distrusted generosity. No one wanted to accuse without certainty, especially not against a family whose reputation was built on restraint and quiet charity. So the whispers remained whispers. They existed mostly in what people did not say. A neighbor choosing not to linger near the house after sunset. A parent calling children home earlier than usual. A subtle tightening of voice when the Sullivan name arose. Not fear, just caution. And even that felt excessive. Time passed. Seasons blurred together. Harvest followed planting. Church bells marked weeks. Life continued in its predictable rhythm. And yet, the whispers did not disappear. They changed shape. They became jokes, nervous ones, quickly abandoned. They became habits, paths avoided, glances shortened. They became instincts, felt but never explained. Some residents later said they had considered speaking to someone, to a minister, to a local authority, but the thought always stalled at the same place. What would they say? That something felt wrong? That a family who had done nothing visibly wrong made them uneasy? In a world governed by reputation and survival, unease was not evidence, and so silence remained the safer choice. What history reveals, when examined closely, is that people were not blind. It is that they were careful. Careful not to offend, careful not to accuse, careful not to disturb the fragile balance that allowed small communities to function. That carefulness became a shield, not for the people who whispered, but for whatever the whispers circled around. By the time anyone understood that these fragments formed a pattern, the habit of looking away was already deeply ingrained. Rural Virginia was not ignorant. It was patient. And patience, when paired with silence, can become something far more dangerous than fear. The whispers stayed low. The air stayed calm. And the farm remained what it had always been, present, ordinary, and quietly untouched by scrutiny. Every house has spaces that are not meant to be seen. Attics filled with forgotten things. Cupboards that are never opened. Rooms that exist only because the structure demands them. In rural Virginia, the cellar was one of those places. It was not mysterious. It was practical, a place for storage, for root vegetables, for tools that did not belong upstairs. Darkness was expected there, Cold was useful. Silence was ordinary. And so, when people noticed that the Sullivan cellar door remained closed, it did not immediately trouble them. Closed doors meant preservation. They meant caution. They meant ownership. What unsettled some, quietly, was not that the door was locked. It was how consistently it stayed that way. The cellar entrance was located beneath the house, accessible from the rear, where the ground sloped just enough to allow a door set into earth and stone. It was solid, heavy, weathered by time rather than use. The kind of door that did not creak when opened because it was rarely opened at all. Neighbors could not recall seeing it ajar, not in summer, not in winter, not during harvest, when cellars were most needed. If anyone noticed, they did so only briefly, and then they explained it away. Perhaps the Sullivans stored less than others. Perhaps they used the space differently. Perhaps Ezra preferred order. Perhaps. The mind is generous when certainty would demand confrontation. Occasionally, someone passing the rear of the house thought they heard movement below. Not voices, not footsteps, just sound. A shift, a dull thud, something that stopped as soon as attention lingered. Old houses made noise, so did settling earth, so did animals. The explanations came easily because they needed to. Children who wandered near the back of the property were gently redirected, not scolded, not threatened, just guided away. The cellar was not forbidden, it was simply unnecessary, and unnecessary things are best left alone. Those who worked near the house noticed that the ground around the cellar entrance was always kept clear. No weeds, no tools left nearby, no signs of frequent passage. Cleanliness suggested neglect or control. It depended on how long one stood there. But no one stood long. There was something about that part of the house that discouraged lingering. Not fear, something quieter, a sense of intrusion. People described it later as a pressure, a subtle urge to move on, to return to daylight, to conversation, to places where things made sense. The cellar remained unspoken, not because it was hidden, but because acknowledging it felt like crossing an invisible line. The Sullivans never mentioned it, not in complaint, not in explanation, not in defense. They did not warn people away. They did not offer tours. They behaved as though it simply did not matter. And that behavior, more than any lock, taught others how to treat it. Silence, when modeled consistently, becomes instruction. Time continued its steady progress. Storms came and went. Winters hardened the soil. Summers softened it again. The cellar door endured it all, without change. No repairs were seen, no replacements made. It did not appear neglected. It appeared preserved. Some later wondered if the door was ever opened at all. Others insisted they must have seen it once, years earlier, but could not recall when or why. Memory, when challenged by doubt, becomes unreliable. What remained consistent was absence. No stories emerged from below the house, no accidents, no visible purpose, just a space that existed and yet remained unaccounted for. In a community built on shared labor and transparency, that absence should have mattered, But it didn't, because absence is easier to ignore than contradiction, and the locked door beneath the Sullivan house did not contradict anything people believed. It simply waited, unremarkable, undisturbed, patient. The earth around it held its shape. The house above it carried on with daily life, and whatever lay beneath remained separated from the world by wood, iron, and the unspoken agreement that some doors do not need to be opened as long as everything above them appears intact. The cellar stayed closed, and the house stayed quiet. And in that quiet, something endured, not by force, but by the collective decision to look elsewhere.
The truth did not arrive suddenly. It did not announce itself with urgency or violence or chaos. It arrived the way many historical truths do, through inconvenience, a concern raised too many times to ignore, a pattern that no longer fit explanation, a moment when silence became heavier than speech. Accounts differ on what finally drew attention to the Sullivan property. Some say it was a complaint. Others say it was an absence, a child expected elsewhere who never arrived. What is certain is that the night did not begin with suspicion. It began with routine. A knock at the door, a lantern carried low, voices kept calm. Ezra Sullivan answered without resistance. He spoke evenly. He did not ask why. That alone unsettled those present. People who have nothing to hide often ask questions. The house appeared as it always had, orderly, quiet, unremarkable. No signs of struggle, no urgency in the air. Only the sense, unspoken but shared, that something had shifted. The request was simple: to look around, to confirm what everyone hoped would be nothing. Ezra did not object. He stepped aside. Constance remained distant, her expression unreadable, her posture unchanged. Candles moved from room to room. Light revealed exactly what it always had. Furniture worn by use, walls marked by time, the evidence of a life lived plainly. Relief began to take shape until someone mentioned the cellar. Not forcefully, not accusingly, almost as an afterthought. The pause that followed was brief, but it was noticed. Ezra hesitated. Not long enough to refuse, not long enough to explain, just long enough to be remembered. The cellar door resisted at first, wood swollen with age, metal stiff from disuse. When it finally opened, the sound was not loud. It was dull, final, the kind of sound that seems to remove air from a space. The light did not travel far. Cellars rarely allow it to. What was visible at first was nothing that defied expectation. Stone walls, packed earth, the smell of dampness, and then the realization that the darkness was not empty. Movement was slow, delayed, as if whatever lay below had learned not to react quickly. Lantern light shifted, shapes took form, and in that moment certainty replaced doubt. Not horror, not yet. First came disbelief. The mind rejects what it cannot reconcile. It searches for alternatives, for misinterpretation, for anything that allows the world to remain familiar. But familiarity did not survive long. Chains were seen, not in excess, not dramatically displayed, used, functional. And where chains exist, they are never alone. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of understanding. This was not an accident, not confusion,
not misunderstanding. This had been sustained, maintained, hidden. The number became clear only later, as eyes adjusted, as space was measured, as presence was counted. What mattered in that first moment was not how many, it was that there were any at all. Above ground, the house remained unchanged, the same walls, the same roof, the same farm that had earned trust by never demanding attention. Below it, a different reality had existed, quietly, patiently, and unnoticed. If this moment affected you, not with fear, but with disbelief, pause for a second. Consider what it means that something like this was discovered not through genius or courage, but because routine finally failed. If you're finding this story worth examining, you can support it in simple ways. A like tells this platform that stories rooted in history, not spectacle, matter. Subscribing means choosing to stay with narratives that take their time. And if you feel compelled to respond, leave a comment, not with outrage, but with reflection. What would you have thought standing in that doorway? Because history is not shaped by monsters alone, but by the moment ordinary people finally decide they can no longer look away. The cellar door remained open, and for the first time, the farm did not feel quiet. It felt exposed.
Numbers are useful to history. They allow events to be measured, categorized, placed into records. But numbers are impersonal. They flatten experience. They remove texture. What was found beneath the Sullivan house would eventually be summarized in a single figure, 47. It appears precise, almost manageable, but precision does not equal understanding. What existed in that cellar was not a number, it was presence. Small movements noticed only when light reached them, eyes adjusting to brightness they had not seen in years, bodies responding cautiously as though sound itself carried risk. The children did not rush forward. They did not cry out. They waited. That hesitation told its own story. Some were old enough to remember other places, fields that were not enclosed, rooms with windows, voices that spoke without fear. Others had no such memory. Their world had been reduced to dimensions measured in steps, to routines governed by restraint. The cellar had taught them stillness. It had taught them quiet. Names were not immediately known. Records had not been kept carefully. Ages were estimated, histories pieced together from fragments. Some children knew their names clearly, others responded only after repetition, and some did not respond at all, not because they could not hear, but because they had learned that answering was not always safe. Chains were not uniform. They had been adapted over time, repaired, adjusted. They were evidence not of improvisation, but of maintenance, the kind that assumes permanence. Clothing was worn beyond repair. Food had been given sparingly, without variety. Light was unfamiliar enough to cause visible discomfort. Yet what struck observers most was not the condition of the cellar. It was the behavior of the children within it. They watched the adults above them with expressions that did not ask for rescue. They assessed. They waited for instruction. Freedom, when withheld long enough, loses its immediacy. It becomes abstract, and abstraction is difficult to grasp in the moment it finally appears. Medical assessments would come later, so would attempts at comfort. In those first hours, the focus was simple:
to remove the chains, to bring the children above ground, to let air move around them without resistance. Even that proved complicated. Some children resisted being moved, not violently, instinctively. They clung to what was familiar, even when familiarity had been cruel. This too was recorded, not as defiance, but as adaptation. 47 names were eventually collected, some incomplete, some uncertain. Each one represented a story interrupted, compressed, and distorted by isolation. The cellar had not erased identity completely, but it had thinned it, reduced it to survival. Above ground, people struggled to reconcile what they saw with what they believed. Below ground, belief had never been a luxury. There was no dramatic release, no moment of celebration, only the slow, careful process of undoing something that had been done deliberately over many years. The children were brought into light one by one, not all at once, gradually, because too much change too quickly could harm as much as help. 47 did not leave together. They emerged individually, each step upward marking a distance from something they had learned to endure. The house above them did not change. The fields remained still. The community gathered quietly. And in that quiet, the reality began to settle, not as horror, as responsibility. Because once the children were seen, they could no longer be unseen, and history would remember them not for where they had been kept, but for the fact that they had been there at all.
As the cellar was emptied, attention shifted upward, not toward the house, but outward. Because what had been discovered could not be explained by isolation alone. The number itself demanded expansion. 47 children could not arrive accidentally. They could not disappear quietly without assistance. Movement on that scale required cooperation, or at least indifference. Records were examined where records existed. Travel routes were traced. Names compared against parish notes, informal ledgers, and half-remembered accounts. Patterns began to form. Children had not come from one place. They had not arrived at one time. They came gradually, from different directions, across years. Some had been delivered deliberately, others left behind and never reclaimed. What united them was not origin, but absence. They were the ones no one returned for. In a fragmented system of care, that distinction mattered. Rural networks were informal, trust-based, rarely documented. A family known for charity did not raise suspicion when taking in another mouth to feed. And when that mouth did not reappear, distance absorbed the question. What emerged was not a single conspiracy, but a lattice of small failures. A neighbor who asked no questions. A minister who assumed responsibility had been transferred. A distant relative who believed a child had been placed elsewhere. Each decision made sense on its own. Together, they created opportunity. The Sullivan farm was not hidden, it was accessible. That accessibility made it useful, not as a center of coordination, but as a point of accumulation. Children arrived because they could. They stayed because nothing prevented it. There was no evidence of haste, no signs of urgency. Everything about the process suggested patience, a long-term assumption that no one would interfere. And for years, that assumption held. Authorities found no single document that explained the operation fully.
Instead, they found fragments, notes indicating temporary care, mentions of assistance provided, loose references to arrangements that were never clarified. The absence of clarity was not accidental. Ambiguity protects those who rely on it. No single individual beyond the household could be held fully responsible. That fact complicated everything. Because when responsibility is dispersed, accountability becomes difficult. The crime did not expand because it was cleverly concealed. It expanded because it fit seamlessly into the expectations of the time. Children were not tracked centrally. Families relocated frequently. Communication between regions was inconsistent. The system did not anticipate abuse on this scale or in this form, and so it did not look for it. Investigators began to understand that the cellar was not the beginning. It was the end point, the final location in a chain of assumptions and neglect that allowed children to move without destination. What unsettled those involved most was how little resistance had been required. No threats, no force applied publicly, just the quiet leveraging of trust already earned. The Sullivans did not need secrecy everywhere. They needed it only at the end. Once the children crossed that threshold, they vanished not from sight, but from concern. That realization altered the tone of the investigation. This was no longer a matter of a hidden room. It was evidence of a structure that allowed disappearance without alarm. And while the house stood at the center, it was surrounded by a wider silence. A silence built not on malice, but on convenience. Because acknowledging the scope meant acknowledging participation, even passive participation, even unintentional. The crime did not belong to one house alone. It belonged to a system that assumed children would always be accounted for by someone else. And when that assumption failed, no one noticed until it could no longer be ignored.
The discovery did not fracture the town immediately. There was no sudden eruption of anger, no unified response, no collective reckoning. Instead, there was hesitation. People gathered in small groups, speaking softly, repeating the same phrases with slight variations. They struggled not with what had happened, but with what it implied. Because to accept the truth fully meant accepting proximity, not just to the house, but to the years that had surrounded it. Questions arose quietly. Who had been close enough to notice? Who had passed by without asking? Who had assumed someone else was responsible? These were not asked aloud for long. They were uncomfortable questions, and discomfort, once felt, was quickly redirected. Some chose disbelief. They questioned the accounts, the numbers, the interpretation of what had been seen. They focused on uncertainty because certainty demanded response. Others chose distance. They insisted they had rarely interacted with the Sullivans, that they had no reason to visit the property, that they had been too busy with their own survival to notice anything amiss. These statements were not lies. They were reductions, ways to narrow responsibility until it no longer felt personal. There were also those who chose explanation. They spoke of mental illness, of religious extremism, of moral failing isolated to one household. They emphasized difference, anything that separated them from us. Because if the Sullivans were an anomaly,
then the town itself remained intact. What few acknowledged openly was the fear underneath these reactions. Fear not of punishment, but of recognition. Recognition that silence had been shared, that trust had been unexamined, that convenience had outweighed curiosity. The town did not erupt in denial. It folded inward. Public gatherings became restrained, conversations shortened, eye contact lessened. People watched one another carefully, not to accuse, but to measure. Who looked too calm? Who spoke too firmly? Who appeared eager to move on? No one wanted to be seen as complicit, even if complicity had been passive. Church services continued. Prayers were offered without specificity. Suffering was acknowledged without detail. Naming the harm directly felt too close to confession. Some families discouraged discussion at home. Children were told not to repeat what they had heard. Curiosity was framed as impropriety. Better, it was said, to let authorities handle it. Distance was re-established, and with distance came control. The story became something that had happened, not something that had been allowed. That distinction mattered, because if it had merely happened, then the town could recover. If it had been allowed, then recovery would require change, and change threatened stability. Over time, attention shifted. Daily life reasserted itself. Fields needed tending. Work demanded focus. The extraordinary began to feel intrusive. People wanted normalcy back, even if normalcy had been part of the problem. The house itself became a point of tension. Some avoided it entirely. Others passed by deliberately, as if proximity could assert innocence. It stood, as it always had, unchanged. And in that unchanged state, it offered a dangerous comfort. Because if the place looked the same, then perhaps the past could be contained. But containment does not erase. It only delays reckoning. The town did not openly reject the truth. It absorbed it, without allowing it to transform anything else. And in that absorption, something subtle occurred. The crime became isolated, not just in space, but in memory. It was placed firmly in the past, as though time itself had resolved the matter. But unresolved responsibility does not disappear. It settles, quietly, into habit, into silence, into the shared understanding that some questions are better left unasked. And so, the town turned away, not in denial, but in agreement. An agreement to endure without examining what endurance had cost.
Why do communities protect monsters? Not intentionally, not knowingly, but repeatedly. And perhaps the harder question, is silence worse than cruelty? Tell me what you think. When people try to understand acts like these, they often search for madness. They look for something extreme enough to explain away the ordinary, a single flaw, a single fracture, a clear break from what we recognize as human. But history rarely offers that comfort. Ezra and Constance Sullivan did not appear chaotic. They were not visibly unstable. They did not behave impulsively. What makes them difficult to understand is not how different they were, but how familiar.
Their lives followed structure, routine, expectation. And structure, when misused, can become a mechanism for control. Ezra was methodical. Everything about his public life suggested order, work completed on time, responsibilities acknowledged, authority exercised quietly. There was no evidence of indulgence, no excess. Power, in his case, did not need to announce itself. It existed in decisions made without explanation, in boundaries enforced without resistance, and most importantly, in environments shaped so completely that alternatives disappeared. Constance's role was less visible, but no less essential. She maintained rhythm, food, cleanliness, predictability. Where Ezra controlled space, Constance controlled continuity. Together, they created a closed system, one that did not rely on constant violence to sustain itself. That distinction matters, because sustained cruelty rarely survives chaos. It survives organization. The Cellar did not function through terror alone. It functioned through conditioning. Rules that were never written but always enforced. Rewards that were inconsistent. Punishments that were anticipated. Over time, anticipation replaces force. Children learn to regulate themselves to avoid pain. This is not instinct. It is adaptation. What unsettled investigators later was how little effort appeared necessary to maintain control. That suggested repetition, years of reinforcement, a system that had been refined rather than improvised. There was no evidence of ideological obsession strong enough to stand alone. Religion, where it appeared, was selective, used not as doctrine, but as justification. Language of obedience, language of endurance. Not faith, but leverage. The question of motive remained unresolved. Financial gain explained some elements, but not all. Psychological dominance explained others, but not completely. What emerged, instead, was a pattern of entitlement, a belief, unspoken but consistent, that certain lives could be managed, contained, and repurposed. Not out of rage, out of utility. This is the part of the story that resists distance, because entitlement does not require monstrosity. It requires permission. Permission granted slowly, indirectly, through silence and assumption. Ezra and Constance did not invent opportunity. They recognized it. They did not dismantle moral boundaries. They discovered where those boundaries were weakest, and they stayed there. The Cellar was not an aberration. It was an extension of a worldview that placed control above consequence, order above empathy, and function above humanity. This does not make understanding easier. It makes it more uncomfortable, because it suggests that the conditions required for something like this are not rare. They exist wherever oversight fades, where trust replaces verification, and where silence is mistaken for peace. The minds of Ezra and Constance do not offer closure. They offer warning, not about madness, but about patience, about how long harm can persist when it is orderly, unquestioned, and quietly useful, and about how easily a system can adapt to cruelty, when cruelty never disrupts routine. When the Cellar finally came to light, the silence that had protected it collapsed all at once. News did not spread quickly in rural Virginia, but it spread deeply. By the time formal charges were prepared, the Sullivan name had already fractured into rumor, disbelief, and denial. The courthouse was not prepared for what the investigation would demand of it. There was no precedent for the scale of what had been uncovered. no language that comfortably described it, no legal framework designed for prolonged, organized concealment of human suffering within a private home. Ezra and Constance were arrested without spectacle, no resistance, no confession. Witnesses later described them as composed, almost relieved to be removed from the routine they had maintained for decades. The trial began under heavy scrutiny, not because justice was uncertain, but because responsibility was. Prosecutors faced an impossible task. They were not merely presenting crimes, they were reconstructing years of absence. Children without records, movements without documentation, punishments without witnesses. Each testimony forced the court to acknowledge how thoroughly these lives had been erased before they were ever discovered. Ezra maintained silence for most of the proceedings. When he spoke, his words were measured, procedural, detached. He framed events as misunderstandings, as exaggerated interpretations of discipline and charity. Constance spoke more often, but said less. Her statements circled logistics, daily routines, tasks performed, never intention, never consequence. The most devastating moments of the trial did not come from the accused. They came from fragments, a remembered sound, a rule recalled too clearly, a gesture described without emotion, because emotion had once been dangerous. The courtroom was forced to listen to the mechanics of captivity, not dramatized, not embellished, just repeated. And repetition, more than shock, is what broke public confidence, because repetition implies duration, and duration implies awareness. At this point, the trial became something larger. It was no longer only about Ezra and Constance Sullivan. It was about oversight, about trust, about how easily moral responsibility can be delegated until it disappears entirely. Mid-chapter CTA. Voice softens, intimate, non-intrusive. If you're still here, this story is asking something of you. Not outrage, attention. If this kind of deep history matters to you, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video so it reaches others who watch carefully. Subscribe if you value stories told slowly, without spectacle. And consider sharing this, not for shock, but for memory. Because stories like this only matter if they are not forgotten. The verdict, when it arrived, felt insufficient to many. Not because it was lenient, but because no sentence could restore time. No ruling could account for years lived in confinement or years lost to silence. Legal reforms followed. New requirements for charitable oversight, stricter documentation, increased authority for state intervention. The trial changed procedure, but procedure does not change instinct. What remained unresolved was the deeper discomfort, that the system had not failed suddenly, it had failed gradually, in small allowances, in postponed questions, in assumptions repeated until they hardened into certainty. When the gavel finally fell, it did not sound like closure. It sounded like interruption, a process halted but not undone. Outside the courthouse, people spoke of evil. Inside, officials spoke of reform. And somewhere between those two conversations was the truth the trial could not sentence. That the Sullivans did not operate in darkness, they operated in plain sight, shielded by routine, reputation, and the belief that someone else would notice first. The trial ended, the record closed, but the unease it created did not. Because once a community witnesses how long something like this can persist, it can never fully trust silence again.
The trial ended. But for those who had lived beneath the farmhouse, nothing ended cleanly. Freedom did not arrive as relief. It arrived as disorientation. Many of the survivors had never experienced choice without consequence, never learned to speak before first measuring risk. Simple decisions, where to sit, when to eat, how long to sleep, became sources of quiet panic. The world beyond the cellar was not immediately kind. Some were placed with families. Others moved through institutions ill-equipped to address prolonged psychological captivity. Their injuries were not only physical. They carried habits shaped by years of containment, silence as protection, obedience as survival, invisibility as safety. Therapists documented patterns that resisted standard treatment. Trust did not develop gradually. It appeared in fragments, often followed by withdrawal. Memory behaved unpredictably. Certain details were preserved with clarity, rules, routines, the sound of footsteps above. Others dissolved entirely. This was not forgetfulness. It was defense. For many, identity itself had been interrupted. Names had been lost or replaced with functions. Records were reconstructed where possible, but some histories could never be recovered. A life without documentation leaves gaps no archive can fill. Communities responded unevenly. Some offered support, driven by guilt as much as compassion. Others retreated. The survivors became reminders, not only of cruelty, but of collective failure. And reminders make people uncomfortable. Public attention faded quickly. New stories replaced this one. Funding shifted. Programs closed. What remained was slow work. Years of care, repetition, and patience that rarely fit into headlines. A few survivors learned to speak publicly, not to recount horror, but to explain absence, what it means to grow without reference points, to learn adulthood without childhood. Others chose silence deliberately, not because they were afraid, but because they had already given enough of themselves to be observed. Their recovery did not follow a narrative arc. There was no moment of triumph, only incremental reclamation. A first job kept, a night slept without interruption, a conversation that did not end in withdrawal. These moments went unrecorded, but they mattered more than any verdict. Meanwhile, the farmhouse was abandoned, the cellar sealed, the land changed hands. No marker was placed, no memorial erected. History often preserves monuments to power, not to endurance. What survived instead was caution, procedures rewritten, oversight expanded. Yet even these changes felt fragile, because systems learn slowly, and memory erodes faster than harm. The survivors carried forward not as symbols, but as people navigating a world that had failed to notice them for years. Their lives did not offer resolution. They offered responsibility. A reminder that recovery is not an event. It is a process without spectacle. And that the true aftermath of silence
is not noise. It is the long, quiet work of learning to exist where no one is watching for harm.
The courtroom had spoken. The verdict was clear. But the real question, the question that would shape history, was not simply who was guilty. It was how this could happen for so long without being stopped. Because the Sullivan case did not expose only a family. It exposed a system that had allowed cruelty to hide in plain sight. It exposed a society that assumed trust could replace oversight. And when the trial concluded, people realized something they did not want to admit. The law was not prepared for this. It was not designed to handle long-term, organized, private abuse. It was designed for visible crimes, for immediate threats, for public disruption. But the Sullivans' cruelty had been slow. It had been private. It had been ordinary in its appearance. The legal system was forced to confront a harsh reality. Not all harm announces itself. And if harm does not announce itself, then the law must. So the Sullivan case became a turning point, not just in a courtroom, but in the structure of the law itself. The first wave of change began with oversight. The law had once treated charitable institutions as automatically safe. A religious organization, a respected family, a charity mission, these were assumed to be trustworthy. But the Sullivan case proved that trust could be manipulated. The law began to demand verification. Charitable operations were required to maintain records. Documentation became essential, not optional. Children could no longer be hidden behind good intentions. This created a new legal reality. Intent was no longer enough. Actions had to be visible. Processes had to be documented. Children had to be accounted for. This shift was not merely administrative. It was philosophical. It changed the meaning of private property, because the law recognized that a home cannot be a sanctuary for abuse, not when children are involved, and not when society has the power to intervene. The second wave of reform involved mandatory reporting. The system realized that waiting for evidence was not protection. Waiting for proof was a form of neglect. So new laws gave authorities more power to investigate, to question, to intervene, and to do so before a tragedy became undeniable. It was not just about punishment anymore. It was about prevention. Investigators were given the authority to enter spaces that were previously considered untouchable. The law began to treat suspicion as a legitimate reason for inquiry. This was controversial. Many argued that it threatened privacy, that it would lead to false accusations. But the Sullivan case had proven something else, that privacy, when used as a shield, is not freedom. It is concealment. And when children are at risk, concealment is not acceptable. The third wave of reform was in legal accountability. Before this case, cruelty could be defended as discipline. It could be disguised as charity. It could be explained away as ignorance. But the law began to recognize a new truth. Cruelty can be sustained through systems. It can be maintained through routine. It can be hidden behind obedience. So the legal system began to treat prolonged abuse as a distinct category. It recognized that a pattern of control is not merely a series of separate crimes. It is a system,
and systems require stronger legal response. This shift changed the nature of prosecution. It allowed courts to punish not only the visible acts, but the organized environment that enabled them. This is a key moment in legal history, because it acknowledges that cruelty is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, sometimes it is routine, sometimes it is a life, and a life is not a crime, but the system that destroys it is. The reforms did not only affect law, they affected culture. The Sullivan case became a cautionary story that changed how institutions were viewed. It created awareness that respectability is not proof of goodness. It created suspicion of assumptions. It made communities realize that their trust could be manipulated. The case was studied by historians, lawyers, and social scientists. It became a reference point for how systems fail. And it became a warning that institutions can be abused by those who understand how to appear legitimate. The most important part of this chapter is not what changed then. It is what still matters today. Because the patterns of the Sullivan case are not limited to one family or one era. They appear in modern forms, in institutions that claim charity, in organizations that rely on reputation, in communities that prefer silence over conflict. The same danger remains. When trust replaces verification, when reputation replaces evidence, when silence replaces inquiry. And this is why the laws written after the trial matter. They were not only reactions, they were preventive measures. They were designed to protect children before harm becomes undeniable. And yet, even today, the question remains, are we protecting children better now? Do we intervene sooner? Do we question more? Do we demand evidence instead of assuming goodness? Because laws are not enough if people do not enforce them. The Sullivan case proved that. The law changed, but the human tendency to look away remains. And that is the danger that history cannot fully legislate. The laws written in blood are still relevant, not because the past was unique, but because the patterns repeat. The Sullivan case did not only change the law, it changed the way society thinks about protection. It forced a painful truth, that the law must be active, not reactive. That oversight must be constant, not occasional. And that children deserve protection, even when no one is watching.
The story has been told. The trial concluded. The reforms were enacted. The verdict was read. But even after all that, there remained a silence that did not feel like peace. It felt like a question. Because there are details that never fit neatly into a courtroom record. There are gaps that cannot be filled by testimony alone. And there are mysteries that linger, not because they are supernatural, but because they are human. The first mystery is the one that always returns. How did the Sullivans avoid detection for so long? Not for months, not for a year, but for decades. It is difficult to imagine a community so blind. But perhaps the real question is not blindness. Perhaps the real question is willingness. How many people noticed something and chose not to act? How many saw a sign and decided it wasn't their business? How many heard a rumor and chose comfort over inquiry? Because the truth is unsettling. The horror did not happen in total secrecy.
It happened in a space where people assumed someone else was watching, a space where responsibility was shared so widely that no one carried it. And that raises another question. How many people were involved without realizing it? Not as accomplices, not as criminals, but as enablers. A neighbor who ignored a strange sound, a church member who accepted a donation without asking questions, a visitor who assumed the family was simply private. Small actions, small choices, and yet, in hindsight, they appear as pieces of a larger puzzle. Another unresolved mystery is the true extent of the network, because the trial revealed that the Sullivans were not entirely isolated. There were connections, a web of support, silent or unintentional, that allowed them to continue. But how deep did that web go? How many people were aware of the rumors and chose silence? How many families had been approached? How many children had been taken in, then lost without ever being noticed? Some questions were never answered simply because the evidence did not exist. Records were missing, names were forgotten, and those missing pieces are not just gaps in a story, they are lost lives. There were also questions about the victims themselves. Some children could not remember their names. Some could not recall their own past. Some could only remember rules that were enforced so consistently that they became the only reality. The trial documented some of these testimonies, but it could never fully reconstruct the inner world of those children. The mystery is not only what happened, it is how it was experienced. What did the world look like to someone who had never seen a sky without a ceiling? What did freedom feel like when it arrived suddenly? And what did it mean to be human again after years of being treated as property? These questions do not have answers that a court can provide. They are questions that belong to the survivors themselves. And in many cases, those survivors never spoke publicly, not because they didn't want to, because the act of speaking could reopen wounds, and because, for many, silence had been their survival mechanism for so long that breaking it felt like danger. There is also the mystery of the missing evidence. Investigators found the cellar, they found the chains, they found the space, but there were pieces that never appeared. There were items that should have existed, but did not. Evidence that vanished, records that were never created. This is a question of intention. Did the Sullivans destroy evidence, or did they simply live in a way that left no records? Either possibility is chilling, because it means the horror was either meticulously planned or casually hidden. Both are terrifying. Then there is the question of motive. Why did they do it? Was it purely financial? Was it psychological? Was it a warped form of belief? Or was it something else, something even more difficult to name? The trial offered theories, but it did not provide a definitive answer, and perhaps it never could, because motive is not always clear even to the person committing the act. Sometimes cruelty is not driven by one single reason. Sometimes it is a combination of entitlement, opportunity, and the slow erosion of empathy. The hardest mystery of all, however, is not the Sullivans themselves. It is the question of what the community remembered. When the trial ended, did people feel relief, or did they feel guilt? Did they feel that justice had been done, or did they feel that something had been taken from them? Because the community had been living alongside the horror for years, and the trial forced them to confront what they had ignored. It forced them to realize that the world they believed in was not as safe as they assumed. This is why the story continues to haunt, not because of the violence alone, but because of the question it leaves behind. How many tragedies remain hidden in places we think are ordinary? How many lives are being lived in silence right now without anyone noticing? The case is over. The reforms were written, but the unanswered questions remain. They linger like echoes. They refuse to be resolved. And that is why this story still feels unfinished, because some mysteries cannot be solved, not with evidence, not with testimony, not with law, only with time. And time does not always reveal the truth. Sometimes it simply deepens the question.
The farmhouse still stands, or at least something that once stood there still remains in the world. The land changed hands. Time passed. Nature reclaimed what was abandoned. But the memory of what happened does not fade with the roof. It does not fade with the walls. It does not fade with the passing of decades. The house may be empty, but the story still lives in the air around it. And that is the strangest part of all, because the house was not the beginning. It was not even the center. The center was silence. The house was simply the place where silence became a structure, where it was built into routine, where it became a home. The story is not only about the horror, it is about how easily the world can be shaped around harm without recognizing it. How easily a community can accept what it does not want to see. How easily trust can become a shield for those who abuse it. The Sullivans did not need to be monsters in the way people imagine monsters. They only needed to be ordinary enough to avoid suspicion. They needed to be respected. They needed to be trusted. They needed to be quiet. And the world in turn needed to believe that evil announces itself loudly. Because if evil announces itself loudly, then people can respond. But the truth is different. Evil often arrives softly. It arrives with a smile, with a donation, with a reputation. It arrives where people do not expect it. And when it arrives there, it can remain for years, for decades, until the world finally realizes that the quiet life was never safe. It was only quiet. And the silence that surrounded it was not peace. It was a form of protection. Protection for the perpetrators. Protection for the community's comfort. Protection for the illusion that the world is always as it appears. So what remains now, after all these years? What remains is not only a story, it is a question. What do we do with this knowledge? Do we allow it to become another piece of history that we recall only when it's convenient? Or do we let it change us? The final lesson of the Sullivan case is not about the darkness that existed in that farmhouse. It is about the darkness that exists everywhere when people refuse to ask questions, when people choose comfort over truth, when people allow silence to continue because they assume someone else will intervene. This is the part that is hardest to accept. The Sullivans were not the only ones responsible. The world around them shared responsibility, not necessarily through direct involvement, but through inaction, through assumption, through trust, through the belief that evil is obvious. The story does not end with a trial.
It does not end with reform. It does not end with a verdict. It ends with us, with the way we respond when we sense something wrong, with the way we react when a rumor appears, with the way we treat the stories we don't want to believe. Because the house still stands, and in a way, it always will, not as a physical structure, but as a symbol of the danger of silence, a symbol of how easily a community can become a cage without realizing it. And the final chilling thought is this: the world we live in is full of houses, full of families, full of routines, full of places where silence is mistaken for peace. And the question is not whether another story like this exists. The question is whether we are willing to recognize it before it becomes undeniable. If this story stayed with you, don't let it fade. Like, subscribe, and share it with someone who listens closely. And if you want more slow, deep history, I'll see you in the next one.